Welcome everybody, thank you very much for joining us today. This is our 10th support hub this year. Tamina, number 10, we've done lots, haven't we? We don't have one in December, do we? Because December with Christmas run up and things are a bit hectic. So as Tamina very usefully pointed out on social media, we do have an article in the magazine this month, don't we, about what we've done so far and asking for suggestions for next year. So if you've been to any of the support hubs or this is your first one and you've got any ideas of what you'd like us to do in 2024, then please do get in touch and let us know. We can contact comms colleagues and they'll pass that information on. So we're starting to get ideas together and then we'll start to timetable and let people know when the support hubs will be next year. So thank you very much for making time in your day for coming along. This support hub is all about lab training approval, applying for it and hints and tips. So I'm going to hand over to Donna and to Tamina to go through the slides and I'll just monitor the Q&A and the chat as we go through and collect questions at the end if we need to go through any of them. So thank you for joining us again. I think it's over to you, Donna.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. So we've obviously got all of our titles and things at the beginning of this so you can see who we are. So I'm the IBMS Head of Learning and Development. And I'm going to start, and I've kind of called it how to minimise delays to your training of approval applications. So sorry for kind of changing the title, but this is, I suppose, to a certain extent, the focus of what I'm looking at. So there's 3 categories of training approval that you can apply for. So you've got your support staff training approval, and that's obviously for staff that you want to put through the IBMS Certificate of Achievement, parts 1 and 2. You've got your pre-registration training approval. So that's for those that are going to do the certificate of competence and get registered with HCPC. And then you've got post-registration training approval. So that's for your individuals that want to undertake a specialist diploma. And obviously you can apply for 1, 2, or all of those. I'm going to primarily look at first-time applications because obviously if you've done it before, you probably don't need as much help. And first-time applications are the ones that are most likely to get delayed. So all first-time applications need to include the following. So you have to complete the application form and you have to complete it accurately. If there's bits missing, it can get sent back to you. You're going to have to include your training policy or policies, and we're going to be asking you for a variety of information. So you might have this in 1 or more policies and you would need to send all of those that were relevant. You're going to have to send us information about your induction processes that show us what you do. You're going to have to send us information about your health and safety policy and your equality, diversity and inclusion policy. So the approval form looks like this at the beginning. It is really important that it's clear which laboratory training approval is being sought. And I know that sounds like, well, obviously, but because you might be applying for new training approval for one part, but you might be doing renewal for other levels of training approval, you have to be quite careful how you fill this in so that when we look at it, it's clear what it is you're applying for. So if you already have support staff and pre-reg training approval, for example, when you want to renew it, these boxes would be ticked and then you would be filling in the support staff training approval date of expiry here and the pre-reg expiry here. You wouldn't fill anything in the post-reg training down here because you do not currently have approval, but you would be ticking it in the first box to say, yes, we want it. So that way we can understand what's renewal, what's new, what you've got, what you don't have. Sometimes this is not filled in correctly and it causes a lot of confusion and we're kind of going back and forth between ourselves and then we'll have to send it back to the lab to clarify. So it just delays the process if you don't fill this in exactly what it is you're looking for. The section 1 is around the organisation and department details. So your department is like microbiology, haematology, blood sciences, infectious sciences, depends what your department is. The organisation or trust name, so this could be, now it might be, for example, Northwest London Pathology. I'm only saying ones that I'm aware of. Southwest London Pathology, there's lots of them. Or it could be an organisation. So if you work for a private lab, Synovis, HSL, there are other private labs available, just the ones that came to mind. So whatever your organisation is, or your pathology department now, quite often rather than trust, then this is what you put into this box. Your hospital name or your site. So if you are a private laboratory, you work in private laboratory, then it's the laboratory site name and the laboratory address that you would put into these boxes here. And if you're applying for multiple sites and multiple hospitals, then you're going to need to copy and paste this table. So you would have maybe one hospital name here and the hospital address, and then you'd have to copy and paste it for your next site, and the same if you're private and you've got multiple labs. So what's the lab name? What's the lab address? So you just have to copy the table and paste it in. But if you don't tell us all of the departments, you're only going to get given approval for the piece of information that's here. You have to tell us which disciplines are being applied for. All of the disciplines that you're applying for should be selected. So if, for example, you were doing specialist diploma in blood sciences, but you were also doing it in biochemistry and haematology, so you might be offering all 3 specialist diplomas, you would need to tick all of those boxes. So these ones would be the ones that you would select here. If you're doing transfusion science as well, then you select those ones. We've got genetics, point of care, and andrology. Obviously, at the moment, you couldn't select those for specialists because we don't have a specialist diploma qualification in those areas, but you could select them for pre-registration and for the certificate of achievement. While you don't need to be accredited, UCAS or otherwise, to ask for training approval, to get training approval, if you do have any UCAS accreditation, ISO standards, then if you could please fill them in, that would be great. It just helps us and gives us a bit more information. If you are applying for pre-registration training approval, right, you must fill this in. You have to either say, yes, we do placements, or no. Again, if you're not applying for pre-registration training, then you wouldn't fill this in at all. But we've had to reject and send back application forms because they're applying for pre-registration training approval, but they haven't filled in yes or no. And we can't guess whether you're doing placements or not, and we're not going to ask the education team to look through your entire application first to decide if you are. It's here for you to say yes, we're doing them, or no, we're not. If you say yes, then you just fill in the details of the universities that you've got agreements with and the length of the placements that you're offering. So no or yes. If you do take on placement students, then and you've said yes, then you need to fill this bit in. If you said no, you don't need to worry about it. So again, this seems like a simple thing. Do you confirm which approved route the student is currently on? This has to be yes. We have to know which routes that your students are and what it is you're covering. So if you say no, this will get sent back to you and ask for clarification and further details. And then obviously you're going to say yes or no, depending on which routes you're doing. So as we said, if you say yes, you then must complete this. If you ignore it or you don't fill it in, it will get sent back to you to complete. So it just delays your application. It's very important. Staff training details. So if this is the first time form, then you'd be filling this in. If this was just a renewal and you had changes to make, you would do it through the laboratory update form. So at the moment, if you didn't have your IBMS number in here for somebody, we wouldn't send the form back to you. However, moving forwards, because everything's digital for the registration you're aware of, and for the specialist, it will be moving to digital platforms, then individuals are going to be linked partly through their IBMS number, or they would have to be allocated a number. So if you don't fill in their IBMS number and they're not linked to that, they could end up with multiple different accounts. So if you can please fill in somebody's membership number, that'd be great. And you have to fill in their HCPC number. While you don't need to have individuals that have completed training, it is strongly recommended, and this is in the guidance document, strongly recommended that if you've got a training coordinator, training manager, that you would be a member or fellow of the Institute 5 years post-reg, and that you would have completed at least, for example, the certificate of expert practice or other vocational training. And if you've got training officers, then again, this kind of the courses that we run for the verification, for examination, train the trainers, these are useful courses for those individuals. And if you could send them on that, that's great, and provide details here. So again, it gives us an idea of what experience you have within the department when you're applying for training approval. It is IBMS qualifications. Individuals need to know what those IBMS qualifications are and how to complete them. If you had multiple people, again, sorry, you would need to copy the box and paste it in and fill it in for every individual. Section 3 is the declaration of compliance. So this is you saying yes, that you have all of these things, or no, that you don't. So for the first one, it's saying that you've got these policies in place and they're accessible to staff. So the location might be, all labs plus whatever QPulse, whatever your quality management system is. And so you would be expected to say yes for these, because these are all policies that you must have and that we would need to see. So these have to be filled in as yes. Again, if you just don't fill things in, it will get sent back to you. And I keep mentioning this because we don't want to send it back to you. We just want to get the form and be able to process it. We don't want to delay it for you. All of these policies, you're being asked to confirm that these requirements are met. And the expectation is that this information will be somewhere within the policies that you're sending us. So it will be checked. But in addition to that here, so for example, pre-registration training approval, health and criminal conviction checks are carried out for trainees and students. So I'm sure you're aware, if you're applying for pre-registration training approval, if you're going to have anybody undertaking the certificate of competence, the lab has to check, do the health and criminal conviction check in the individual, or they have to at least look at it. So whether it's the lab that does it or the individual, it must be checked. And this should be documented in your training policies or your procedures, what happens and that this happens. We have had boxes where this is said no, or it's been missed out. Now, if you can't apply for pre-reg training and say no, because it's a requirement, so you have to say yes. And if you say yes, we expect to see it in the policy. So this is the thing, for anything that you're seeing in the application form, yes, that information needs to be in your policy documents. So when the education team are first looking at this, they're just going through to check, is the information appropriate? Is it accurate? Is this what we're looking for? Yes, they can then send it to somebody to look at in more detail. And they will then be comparing what you've said to the information that's in your policies and comparing it against what we require. So what guidance documentation tells you. There are a couple of boxes in this field that you need to fill in. So where it says, I've got people in front of me, I can't see my own little bits and pieces here. So regular monitoring and evaluation systems for training in place, right? Indicate how often. So this form has been filled in and said monthly, perfect. If you don't fill it in, again, when the education team look at this, they see something missing. So it could get sent back to you, because otherwise it has to get sent to an individual who has to go through all of your policies and find this information. How often do people meet with you? So if you can please fill this in, it's less likely to cause delays to your application. And it's the same, there's a named person that's got overall responsibility for the training process. You must put their name and their HCPC number in here. And it's just so we can see it on this first application form. Another bit that people don't fill in, and we definitely have to send it back to you, is this part here, where it asks about how many registered biomedical scientists you've got, clinical scientists, trainees, etc. Now, this is important because it forms part of the standards. We need to know how many people you've got, how many people are there to support the training process, how many trainees are you trying to support, are you planning to support, what have you got at the moment, what are you looking for? We need this filled in. If we get quite a few of these where nothing has been entered here, they have to come back to you. We don't know how many people you've got in your laboratory, so you need to tell us that. This is again where you're confirming the training policy contains all of these topics. So you've got things like overview of training and education in the department. So that's all of your training, whether it's IBMS or not. So you might be supporting apprenticeships, you might be supporting MSCs, you might have various CPD programs. So we would expect to see that overarching training and education that happens within your department. We would ideally like to see that you've got training available to all staff grades. It might not be that you've got a certificate of achievement, maybe that's not what you're doing, but you've got other training that supports your support staff. So we would expect to see that mentioned in there. Your competency programme. So obviously everybody's going to have some kind of training and competence programme. It should be mentioned in your documents that you're sending to us. We should be able to see that. And that can include like how often does somebody know if they need to get reassessed? What is the competency schedule? So it should just contain the information that somebody understands what your lab does. Support roles. So if you mention training officers, mentors, training coordinators in your policy anywhere, then they should be quite clearly, it will say what these roles are and what that means for the training. And you should at least have your training officer. So there has to be at least somebody associated with training if you're going to be applying for laboratory training approval. You have to talk about the relevant professional bodies. So if you're applying for any IBMS level of training approval, then obviously the IBMS has to be mentioned. So the guidance document has got some very nice information about what you can say about is what does the IBMS do? And then you link that to what application you're making. So obviously for pre-reg, you're going to talk about the IBMS, you're going to talk about what they do with the Certificate of Competence and linking that to the HCPC Standards of Proficiency. And again, HCPC would definitely have to be mentioned. What is their role and what is their relationship, for example, to the pre-registration training? You're then asked, does your training policy include the following topics? Now, if you do not have a certificate of achievement in place, and that's not what you're applying for support staff, then your answer is no. If you do, then the answer has to be yes, because if you're doing it, it has to be mentioned in your training policy. And that's the same for the registration and the specialist. If you don't do specialist diplomas, then your answer is going to be no, because you're not going to be mentioning them. But you would be expected to be mentioning all of the ones that you do. If you do placement students, so if you take on placement students, there should be information in your training policy that outlines what that process is. What do you do with your placement students? And then there should be full details of your monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. So again, if you say yes here, that's what we're looking for in your policy, and you have to say yes. So we need to know, how often do you see, how often is somebody seen? Like, what's the minimum amount of time that they will be supported by their training officer or mentor or whoever it is that you've got within those roles. But the training officer would be expected to look over their work and sign off their work. How does that happen? The evaluation mechanisms. Have you got examples of how they're going to collect their evidence, what kind of evidence they're going to collect, and what those processes are? So that should all be within your training policy, and obviously you should select the appropriate answer here. So as I've said, this should be evidenced in your documents that you send us. So please make sure that whenever you send your documents, that it would contain, that we can see all of this information. So if it's not in your main training policy, it means you might have to send us some other documents. Sometimes people have got this information in one training document. Other times people have got it spread over because they might have individual training policies for different levels. So you have to make sure that you send everything that we need to see. The training program, so we're asking, do you have a structured training program available for those completing? Now, again, this seems like the obvious answer should be yes, but we've had this where somebody said no for Certificate of Achievement, and that's what they were applying for, Certificate of Achievement training approval. If you're applying for laboratory training approval, obviously you have to have a structured training program, or what are you going to deliver? So the answer has to be yes. If you've got training approval for any of these levels, then you have to be saying yes, and that has to be evidenced within the documents that you're sending us. If you do off-site arrangements, which is outside of your pathology group, we shall say, then that's going to be your off-site arrangements. And you're expected to fill in here what the time frame for that would be. But you might not have off-site arrangements, in which case you don't need to fill anything in here. So off-site arrangements, if it's no, then you wouldn't fill anything in here. If you say yes, then you have to say what the expected time frame is. And that's relevant again, if you're applying for laboratory approval, you're given it for the lab or the labs that you're applying for. If you're sending somebody to an external lab, how much time are they spending off-site? And the guidance will explain to you that the individuals might be signed off at that other site, but they also have to be signed off within your laboratory. It still has to be checked. So we need to know how much time somebody might spend outside of the site that we are given approval for. And then there's just some other questions that you have to answer, yes or no. Again, suitable assessment methods for evidence collection are advised. So again, have you provided examples of information that may be collected and how that's going to be assessed? Your answer has to be yes, and you have to evidence that within your documentation. So I have to keep moving around this little screen. Section 4 is the final declaration. So again, sometimes people don't tick these boxes. So they're not confirming the details are provided are correct. They don't understand that we might audit them. And if you don't say yes, then we can't process the form and it won't get sent back to you. If it's sent to us with if it's not signed off, there's no name, there's no details, again, it's going to get sent back to you. So we're looking for a digital, or if you want to print it off and sign it in pen and send it back, that's fine. But we need this filled in. If it's not, it will get sent back to you. And we're not trying to be horrible, but we need it to be filled in. So as I said, the training policy is going to ask you, the training policy has to include the information that we've asked for, and that's guided. You can see that by when you're filling out the application form as well as the guidance documents. So we want to know what all of your training programs are, all of your CPD opportunities for all of the different grades of staff, and that should be somewhere, as I say, whether it's in 1 or 2 or 3 or more policies. You have to talk about the IBMS, the HCPC, as relevant to the qualifications that you're applying for. When we're talking about registration bodies, if you were undertaking the certificate achievement, if you were doing that for support staff, then you would be expected to mention that they could register with the Science Council when they complete the certificate achievement if they're an IBMS member. So these are just the things that you want to mention. This is all in the guidance document. For each of the levels that you have training approval for, you're going to have to tell us how that's going to be supported. So when you're writing your training policy or you're looking at it, think about, if I was just starting in the lab and I come to join your lab and I want to know, what do you do in terms of training? What can I do? You want to be able to go and see it. You want to see your CPD. You want to see what you can apply for. So, oh, can I apply for a specialist diploma? What is that process? What prerequisites do I need? How do I go through the application process? Once I get it, who's going to support me? What help I can get? Where am I going to rotate to? What different departments do I need to go to? What different sections do I need to go to? How long will I spend there? You want to take it all the way through to the end. So at the end of the process, what happens? What's the assessment process? Who do I submit it to? What happens after that? So you want the individual to understand what they're going to do from beginning to end for any of these qualifications. Now, I've put an example here that your rotation should mention a time frame, even if it's a minimum time frame. And I've used the 1 day, 1 rotation because for registration, quite often people, they might go to quality or point of care. Now, the plan would be lovely to be sending them maybe for a week, but you know that sometimes you can only send them for a day and it's more to get a flavour. So you might have, they're going to definitely spend a minimum of 1 day and 1 rotation there. And that might be it. Obviously, if you put 1 day and 1 rotation for everything, that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate. So try and make it appropriate, but obviously you can't over deliver. So your training policy is the document that somebody's going to look at and expect that you will follow this. So it has to be realistic for your laboratory. Again, we said if you've got placement arrangements, secondments, you have to mention them. If you've got a multi-site organisation and you're moving staff around to train in different locations, again, that should be mentioned within your training policy, what those processes will be. And in addition to the application form and the policies that we've mentioned, you have to provide a completed training programme. On the IBMS website, there's a laboratory approval training template, and that can be used as a guide, or you can just complete the spreadsheet as is and send it with the application form and all of the policies. The details in this document have to match those in the training policies. So I'll just give you an example. So this is the pre-registration example. So in the policy, on the right, you would see they might have listed sections, so specimen reception, send away, heme automation, transfusion, coag automation, morphology. And then in the policy, what they actually had was a trainee would spend a rotation in at least one of, and they'd either be sent to special heme, special coag, or special biochemistry. So that was indicated in the policy, and they had the estimated duration of training. So that's what we expect to see in the laboratory section in the spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet lists all of the standards, and then you need to fill in for each of those standards an example section that somebody could complete that standard in. Now, you're not saying this is the only section that this person can complete this standard in, it's an example section. The assessment methods are going to be those evidences that you're expecting. What is it that you're trying to do? And obviously there might be Q&A as well. You tend to talk to your trainees or to those undertaking specialists. There might be discussions. For the new spreadsheet, because obviously we've got the new registration standards, some of these assessment methods are going to be filled in already with the mandatory evidence that has been provided. So you would only be filling in the ones that hadn't been completed. Now, for the registration portfolio, you may or may not have competencies that relate to the HCPC standards of proficiency. So if you hadn't filled in competencies, this wouldn't mean that it's getting sent back to you. For the specialist, on the other hand, the first section that you sign off in the specialist portfolio is that the individual works according to the standard operating procedures within the laboratory. And so you would expect competencies relating to the portfolio standards in the specialist. If you don't do something in-house and you don't therefore have competencies, then you would expect in the notes section that you will write up how that individual is going to demonstrate that they meet the standards. And it might be just a knowledge-based exercise, but you have to write it in there. So again, if something's missing, it's going to get sent back to you. If you just don't fill something in at all, leave the line blank, which happens, get sent back to you, because we then don't know, do you do it in-house, do you not do it in-house? What are you doing in order to meet this standard? So you have to put the information in. And as I say, the information that we're looking for, the laboratory sections that you're listing within your policy have to match laboratory sections that you're putting against your standards. Because again, if they don't, that's just confusing when the assessor's looking at it. You're like, well, I don't understand, this doesn't relate. And so it doesn't tie in. So we can't accept it, and it will get sent back with queries. So the way that the process works is you get your application received, so you send it to the IBMS, we have a look at it, so education team will have a quick look. If there's bits missing, as I say, for the application form, it's not filled in correctly, it gets sent back to you. That's going to delay it, because then you have to fill it in, send it back to the lab, back to the IBMS, where it's going to have to be in the queue again before it gets looked at again. Once the information's all in the application form, it will get sent to the assessor. The assessor will review it according to the template sheet against all of the guidance documents, and they complete the review form. The review form is returned to the education team. If the review form is saying there's bits missing or I'm not clear about this, then the lab are going to be contacted for additional information. They will then return the additional information to the IBMS. That will go to the assessor, who will then complete the review form and send it back to the education team. If this is still not right, again, it will go back to the lab. And this has happened a couple of times. And what I would say is, if you're unclear or unsure about the information that you're being requested to send, then contact myself or the education team, who will be able to give you somebody specifically to speak to, or can pass you on to myself. We don't want you going round and round here. It's not very helpful to anybody. Once the education team have received the review form where it says, yep, we're happy to award this, then the training approval certificate is issued to the laboratory, and it will be mentioning all of the different laboratories where you have applied approval for. If you don't mention different laboratories, they won't get the training approval. So at the beginning of the form, it's important that you list all of the laboratories that you're applying for the approval for. So that's pretty much the process. We do have a selection of assessors that look at the approval forms. This is a relatively new addition to our processes. Therefore, we're still a little bit behind with the training applications, but we are catching up with them. So I'm going to stop talking and pass over to Mina.
Thank you, Dana. So yeah, I'm just going to give a couple of examples really of additional information that we put into our training policy. So we cover everything that's required of the IBMS, but then to kind of avoid having multiple documents and policies for staff members to read and acknowledge, we just put it all into the training policy because it's related to training and competency. So aside from things like the introduction and listing key staff and responsibilities, we also include our departmental induction process, which will include kind of the HR side of things, as well as the quality induction. So when our staff members, when they first start at the trust, on their sort of during that first week, they will have an induction with the quality manager and learn about accreditation and that kind of thing, and have to read through the quality policy and the manual and acknowledge those documents. We also make sure that any new colleagues read the training policy and then sign that to make sure they've also got the information on the different processes that are involved as part of the training and competency framework. So I've just highlighted in red there the training flowchart, because I put an example of something, a flowchart that I was responsible for putting together with the HR department at the trust that I worked at previously. And it's just to kind of outline the process of the training from when someone starts in a department. We were struggling quite a bit in terms of when it came to recruiting staff members and kind of looking at the way the performance was. It was taking quite a long time to train up new staff members. So we had to put a process in place to kind of manage that and make sure staff members were aware that the training process would be monitored as well. You don't go into a department and then take 2 years before you can go on working on shifts, especially if you are HCPC registered already and completed the portfolio and you've worked in a specialist department previously. So just a few steps that we've put together of you know, the process and what it involves. So things like putting an action plan together first. So the staff member is aware that there is a plan in place. So we do things like a training needs analysis first, put together a training program, and kind of follow that through and have support from the team as well as the training lead. But then if we aren't achieving those targets, actually allowing the staff member to understand that we don't just move straight to kind of performance management. There are lots of steps in between. So, you know, first having a conversation with the trainee or the staff member to kind of understand what is it that might be, are there any challenges that they're facing at the moment that isn't kind of helping them progress in the training. And then once we've identified that, putting in support mechanisms to help that staff member. But then additional steps if they're still not achieving their targets, which will kind of involve conversations with HR and monitoring process. So kind of having that in the policy had really helped, because I think staff members were then aware of the kind of process and what to expect when it came to the training and completing competencies. We also had information on audits, our audit process, when it came to looking at training and competency documentation and the training logs, and, you know, making sure that the competency assessments were renewed on an annual basis on time. Otherwise, we would raise a non-conformance as part of that audit. Listed several qualifications as well that people might be interested in. So this would involve things like the STP for those who want to kind of go down the clinical scientist route or looking into the HSST. We also had the information on training programs and learning contracts as well, and I can give you more information on that in the next couple of slides. But the one that was really important as well was the funding for professional development. So we also used to receive quite a lot of queries when new courses were available or people wanted to apply for the specialist portfolio. There were 2 windows throughout the year when that would be available. So kind of having that in the policy really helps, because then we were able to direct staff to the policy and say there is a procedure, make sure you apply during these windows, and then that will get reviewed at a training committee meeting, and then the funding's approved, and then we can put that forward and then, you know, allow the staff member to complete a course or a new qualification. Next slide, please, Donna. Thank you. So an example of one of the training programs, I know Donna had showed an example earlier. So this one's just of the Certificate of Achievement Part 1. The way that we did this was had a look at the content in the actual portfolio, and then looked at the competency assessments that were relevant to those modules, and then kind of listed them on there. So I don't know if you can see, it's quite small, but there's a lot of information to kind of get into that one table. But again, similar to what Donna had said earlier, listing the number of rotations within each department and the documentation that's associated with each of those modules. Next slide, please, Donna. And again, did the same thing for the registration portfolio, went through modules. So the slide that you can see here is actually mapped to the previous version of the portfolio, so they're not the new one, but this is just an example that I've extracted from the policy that I was involved in writing up. So again, information on the competency assessments that were relevant to those modules, and the duration of the training in each department and how many times they'd be rotating through those sections. Next slide, please, Donna. And then the same thing for one of the specialist portfolios. So this was for haematology and transfusion, the different assessment types. So we used quite a lot of questions and answers, which you have to do anyway as part of one of the pieces of evidence. But again, what types of evidences could be used for each of those? So our competency assessments were actually mapped to the specialist portfolio, just again to avoid that duplication. So when a staff member was completing a specialist portfolio, they were able to gather evidence for the competency assessment, which was then used as part of their specialist portfolio evidence. So things like case studies or practical kind of exercises. Say, for example, in blood transfusion, we do antibody panels. So that would be one piece of evidence for the competency. We'd get them to complete a panel, have someone observing that, get them to kind of talk to us about any antibodies that they've identified, but then use that same sort of competency assessment for the specialist portfolio. So that was listed on the training programme as well. Next slide, please, Donna. Okay, so to do for the training needs analysis, again, it's a separate document where we would record all the kind of information, but we had this as a copy in the appendix in the training policy. And again, this just kind of gave the staff an understanding and an overview of, you know, the kind of things to expect during that training process, especially if you're new and you don't know what to expect, and every trust will do things slightly differently. So we just kept everything in that training policy. So when they were reading through it, they were able to see examples of different documentation and forms that we use. So the training needs analysis, again, we'd introduce it with a little bit of an introduction. So we would write down what the purpose was. So it's to identify the requirements of the trainee and to be able to kind of tailor a training program for each individual, because again, everyone's quite different in terms of experience and the labs that they've worked in and the equipment. So that training needs analysis form would have questions in there, such as, you know, whether that trainee or staff member has experience in that discipline. And if they have, what kind of tasks they've got experience in, if they've got any theoretical knowledge. So again, if they've done the specialist portfolio, you know, that kind of helps having that information on that form. And then putting together a bit of a time frame for the training, depending on that individual, again, whether they're experienced or if they're new. And we would document that, include a signature of the trainee and the training officer, and that would go in the trainee's file then. And just so we've got a record of where that trainee is up to when they progress. Next slide, please, Donna. Thank you. And then we also had an example of training review meeting forms as well. So again, I know the IBMS provide reference copies of these, so we kind of adapted that and tailored it to our trust, introduced that to the staff members, you know, explaining what the purpose of those training review meetings were, making sure they understood that it was an opportunity for discussion and feedback on their training process, and it was an opportunity for them to also highlight you know, things that were going really well during the training and things that might not have been going too well. So we would try for our new staff members to do this on a weekly basis, just to kind of make sure they were progressing as expected. But again, to create a form like this, we would include questions such as, you know, have the targets been met that were set for the previous week or month, whether there were any sections of the training log that were required for completion, and any targets and deadlines that they'd need to achieve either by the next week or the following week. Just depends on kind of which department they're in and how long it's taken. And again, making sure that the signatures of the trainee and the training officer. So it does seem quite strict in the terms of the amount of information required, but we felt like this process was needed, especially when you've got a number of staff who might be new in the department and we're facing challenges in terms of progression. So this kind of really helped manage expectations and also helps us to intervene early if we needed to, by having these regular meetings. Next slide, please, Don, thanks. And then an example of a learning contract. So again, we had different contracts for each type of, say, qualification. So whether that was a registration or specialist. So what we found as well with some staff members waiting for a while to do the specialist portfolio and then eventually having that opportunity, but then not actually completing the work that's set. So taking a lot of the time for the training officer to put together a tailored training program, and then trying to make sure each trainee or staff member has different sets of questions and things to be getting on with, but then not actually receiving anything to provide feedback for. So then you kind of lose that momentum, and before you know it, it's 2 years, 3 years, and that portfolio might have expired by then. So we put in learning contracts to say that if you do start the specialist portfolio or a different qualification, these are the expectations we have, these are the expectations you might have. So kind of getting them to understand the support they'll get from us, but also the commitment that we expect from them as well. And again, the contract would include questions like, what are the objectives and expected outcomes from completing that course or the portfolio? And also the requirement for feedback and sharing of knowledge. So if someone has been provided the opportunity to complete a course or go out to a conference or whatnot, we expect them to come back and kind of share best practice and what they've learned. So it's part of CPD, and also, you know, distributing that to the team. Next slide, please, Donna. Oh, questions. So I think there's one waiting to be answered that's typed up. As a training officer, is there somewhere I can go to, the IBMS site or elsewhere, to obtain information on the types of funding available for staff? I often find this difficult to know where to apply.
Yeah, so Kim's just popped that in. That's quite a new question. I've been answering other ones as we go along. So information on funding you should be able to find from your local practice educator. Kim, if you, I don't know which area of the UK you're in, but the practice educators know about funding opportunities, and they're using that funding to pay for qualifications that the Institute offer. So if you let us know which area you're in, we can probably put you in touch with your practice educator, because they're aware of funding that you can draw down. That should help, hopefully. Donna?
Yeah, apart from that, I was going to say for each of the individual levels of funding, but that would these would be above specialist diploma level. Then the IBMS website, if you look at each of the different levels, then they would be able to tell you what funding was available. That's specifically coming through HEE though.
Yeah,
so
I was just saying, Kim's just put she's in 5. There is some funding from NHS Education Scotland that's just been announced though, Kim. If you have a look at their website, I'll see if I can find their address. They've just announced they're going to fund non-accredited degree assessments for people. I'm not sure if they've got any other funding available, but yeah, that's definitely across Scotland, because I spoke to them last week. Not sure about any of the funding opportunities specifically for Scotland, but if you talk to them about what it is that you need, which qualifications it is you need to access. The reason they spoke to me was they said there's lots of people who are in support worker roles that have done non-accredited degrees that they'd like to support to be able to be trained. So they thought that was a good place to put some money. So if there's a particular need, I'm sure if you speak to them and say this is what we need help with, then hopefully they would listen. So I can see, so Kim's, okay, lovely, great, thanks Kim. So while you were both talking, there were quite a lot of questions in the Q&A, but there were specific questions about people in certain situations and the things that they needed help with. Most of them were around how long it's taking for the lab training approval process. So it might just be worth reiterating that, just in case people didn't catch it. So if it's in renewal and nothing has changed at all, the education team can look at those and they can process them fairly quickly. It depends how busy the inbox is as to how long it takes to process, but usually a few weeks for those. If it's something where there is a new addition to a form, so you've already got training approval, but you're adding something new or different to that, that's kind of a hybrid application. So they've been going to Donna. There's only one Donna, and Donna's got lots of other things to be doing. So that's why we then trained up other assessors as well. So while the assessors are new, we'll just do quality assurance and just check the decisions they're making are consistent across all of the different assessors, that they're consistent with what Donna would do. So we're hoping it is going to get quicker. We know it's frustrating when you're waiting. We do say allow 6 months if you're either a new applicant or you're adding something, rather than letting it expire, just to give us time to process it all and enable that toing and froing. So the purpose of the session today was to advise about common things that people don't do or don't include, wasn't it, Donna, that cause the delay. So if the form's filled in properly, it makes it much quicker at our end for us to be able to process and look at everything that we need to, and that reduces the delays. So that's why we've angled it as we have. But we do say allow 6 months, and on your certificates that should be in the labs, it should tell you when it expires. So it should be that you can look at when the date is, when it's due to expire, and you know when to apply, and you don't end up having a gap, because we know that's really frustrating. Somebody said that they've got an amendment to make, and is it the same application form that you were showing, Donna? It was specifically about adding placement students on. So they currently don't train placement students. They are thinking about doing it from next year. Is it the same form? It's the application form, so it's an amendment to that. Is that right?
Yes. So you can just so we know it's a placement, and then what we want to see is that you've got a policy in place. So we wouldn't necessarily ask to see absolutely everything again, but actually what I forgot to mention, so on the spreadsheet that we have where you've got registration and you're filling it in against the standards, there's also right next to that placement students. Now it might be that you do the exact same for placement students, but you can copy and paste it in, it's the exact same. But if it isn't the same, and that could be just because of the amount of time you've got students or when you've got them, then you would have to make sure that that was completed as you mapping to your documents, your policies, what you do in the lab with your placement students. Now, because it's just saying how do they meet the standards, the chances are that your evidence in the sections are all going to be the same, and most people don't have changes. Some people do, because the way that they run the placements is maybe slightly different to their in-house, right? So you just have to be aware of that. But if you're saying that you've got placement students, we would expect that to be filled in, even if it's just a replica of the registration, just so we know that you've seen it, you've looked at it, and that you're telling us that that's what you do. One of the issues at the moment, obviously, is because if you're now applying for pre-registration training, the standards have changed. So for people who have existing training approval, like Sue has put into place a document that tells you these are the questions that you might be asked about, and that's for the trainers and for the verifiers and for the candidates, and they can see what they might be asked for labs that already have training approval for the old standards. But if you're applying now, you're going to come under the new standards, and so you might have been asked to update your template. So you might have been asked to update that to demonstrate how you're going to meet these new standards. And that's just, we have to be able to say to the HCPC that yes, when we get the training approval, people are definitely going to be able to demonstrate all of these particular standards, and that's all of the new ones. So that's, I just saw a question about somebody saying about the new about a registration that they've been asked to add additional information, and that's one thing that you might be asked at the moment. I know that Tom's dealing with that, so.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Donna. So anybody who is asking for a renewal, even if it is a renewal, but it's for pre-registration, it will have additional information in. So I think at our end, for the education officers, the clearer you can make it as possible in your covering email that says it is a renewal, but we've added this in, it's on this page and we put this information in so they can't miss it, the quicker it will be to process at our end. So I think that will be really useful if you could do that. So anybody who's got pre-registration training approval who will be applying for a renewal, just remember that the standards have changed and your training plan is going to need to change to take care of that. So you may have an existing one that you want to keep in because you've got people who are already on the registration training portfolio, they've started version 4, they're still working through it, that's fine, but you will need to put in the new one to say people who will be issued during this next period where we have approval, this is what they're going to do, just so we've got all the information. Donna's asked a question, I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask Donna to answer it. Is the lab training approval 5 years from the point of application or point where the approval is given?
From when it's given.
Yeah, I thought so. So because there's that to and froing bit, Donna, in the middle, it actually gives you longer. So once we've had everything we need and we sign it off at our end, then it's from that point onwards. So it will be from the month that we send that certificate and say you've got it from 5 years from now.
Yeah, we don't pick it up from where you've, said that you finished, even although you might have applied before that time. We take it from when we issue it to you.
Yeah, and it has a month and a year, doesn't it? So it's really straightforward. So it's easy to follow. Yeah, lovely. I don't think there were any other particular questions in the Q&A that needed a response that I didn't answer while we were talking. People were asking, just for information, that your next Training for Trainers event for verifiers is on the 29th of November. Somebody asked about that, and I popped a link in the chat. If you want to share that with anybody, please feel free to copy that. It is on the web page, on the IBMS web page, on the landing page, so you should be able to find it there as well. I think that's all of the questions, other than why is it being treated as first time or different when it's a renewal? It's because something has changed, doesn't it? So yeah, that's why we need to pick them out. But yeah, they're all the Q&As that came in. Let me just check if there's another one coming.
Somebody's just asked if there's any plans for more IBMS support hubs in 2024.
There are, Kim, yeah. So I was saying that in the preamble before we officially started, as people were starting to join, so you might have just missed it. So we are planning them for next year. Tamina and I have got our heads together. We need to organise exact dates. We will try and keep them on a Wednesday lunchtime because that seems to be working for people to be able to get to them. We've got some ideas for what we'd like to do, but we did an article, didn't we, Tamina, for this month's magazine. So if you have a look at that, Kim, it will say what we've done so far, and if you've got any suggestions for new things that you'd like us to do next year, you can get in contact. There's contact details. It's the comms team. They can collate ideas together and then give them to Mina and I, and we'll get them organised. So we'll, in the next few weeks, we'll certainly choose the ones for the first few months, won't we, Tamina, and get dates and subjects advertised, and then we might do it as a 2-part exercise, or we might just do all of the year. Is there provision for training for internationally trained? So we don't train people at the institute at JA. It would be a laboratory that you would need to go to. But if you are an international applicant, you can apply to the HCPC directly for registration in the UK. I don't know if that's the question you're asking. So we provide training and qualifications for people who are working in the UK. But if you are internationally qualified, you can apply to register to work in the UK through the HCPC directly. I think that's what you're asking rather than us doing it. So it would be the HCPC rather than the IBMS that would do that. We can't help you to find placements, unfortunately, Kimoni. You need to speak to local laboratories and see if they have opportunities. So if you are at university and you're looking for a placement, then your university will help you. Once you've finished, I think you said that you just graduated. Once you've just graduated, you would need to think about where are you living geographically, where is close by, and approach laboratories to say, I've started my portfolio, I need to finish it. Are there any opportunities for me to come and to work in your lab and to finish that? So it's not something that we can coordinate because we don't know what availability people have, how much capacity they have, so we can't impose on them and say. So they normally, placement laboratories will work with their local universities to say what capacity they have and agree a number of students they can take each year. So it maybe you've got connections from where you did your portfolio, where you started it, and you can go back to them and ask if they've got any help. But if not, if you look at areas you could get to, local laboratories that you could get to, then you can try and get in touch with them and see. CPD folder. I don't understand why you have 3 different diplomas online. Does that make any sense to you, Donna, for CPD, logging CPD?
More than one CPD folder online. How can you get to just one? I'm not actually sure I understand the question about having more than one CPD folder. Are you meaning through the IBMS CPD program?
It might be through our system, mightn't it? If so, like just.
I mean, because the way that works is you just log and when you've got 24 activities, you
Yeah.
sort of say I'm done, and then it starts again. I'm not quite sure what you mean by having more than one CPD folder.
Yeah, unless you've opened up a new CPD, but I don't think you can until you've submitted 24.
Yeah.
And then once you've received your
Yeah, you can't.
that's closed, and then you then open up a new one.
So you would see any that you've closed, wouldn't you? You can see any that you've completed, but they're finished. You can only add to the current one that's open.
But you can download the historical ones. So Kimona said they've got one for 2019, 2020 and 2023. So the contents of that, could they still access? Even though they're finished, I assume that you can download it if you want to.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why you're saying why do you have 3PD. I mean, as I say, it just shows you what you've got. If you try to add your certificate and you couldn't add it to any of them, I'm presuming. You can only add it to the one that's open. So once something's completed, that's it, done. You can't add to it. So you can only add to open activities, and you can see which one is open.
And Ajay has asked about training and experience in the UK. For the international route for the HCPC, I don't think they do ask for UK experience, but if you want to get a job in the UK, they may be asking about UK experience. So yeah, you've asked about volunteering. I'm guessing that you might need to apply for other roles, not just band 5 roles. You might consider band 2, 3, 4 roles. And then you can get some UK experience under your belt. So might be looking at different types of roles rather than just biomedical scientist roles, possibly. Okay. I can't see any other questions that have come in apart from the one about the JBL certificate. So I think that's probably all of the questions dealt with.
I was just going to say, if the CPD, so I don't know if anybody can see that. So it's cpd at ibms.org, and they would be able to just check and see if there's an issue. If you're sending them the information, if you can tell them when the date of the JBL is, in case your certificate has opened after the date that you're trying to apply it, because then it won't work. So you need to make sure that you give them all of the information when you email them, so that they can try and find out why you're not able to add it. And obviously, if you can send them your IBMS number, it makes them easy to find you as well. Yeah, I'm sure the team can help if you ask them. So I'm just conscious of time. We're coming up to 1 o'clock, so I can't see any of the questions that have come in the last minute or so while we've been talking. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to Mia and Donna for the presentations. Hopefully people have found those helpful. And if you do have any queries about things taking a while, if you get in touch with me, I'll ask the team and see where they're up to and see if we can work out why there's been a bit of a delay. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for making the time, and hopefully we'll see you again in 2024.